Well, Russia dismisses as baseless reports that the country is orchestrating a false flag incident in order to invade neighboring Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says the allegations are unsubstantiated and not backed by evidence. Western media have said Russia has sent operatives into disputed regions in eastern Ukraine. They've quoted anonymous U.S. officials who echoed Kiev's claims that Moscow is seeking a provocation. For weeks now, the U.S. and the Western military alliance, NATO, have been accusing Russia of planning an attack on Ukraine. That has raised tensions with Moscow, which is unhappy with increased military activity by NATO near its borders. Now, in order to get further insight on that story, I'm joined by Scott Bennett. He is a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer joining us from San Francisco. Mr. Bennett, thank you for joining Press TV. So reports have come out that Russia is orchestrating a false flag operation and is creating a pretext to invade Ukraine. Are these reports backed by evidence? And if not, why are they coming out?
Well, I think it is the West, specifically the United States and the Biden administration and their over-aggressive military that has fabricated this fantasy, and they are really reflecting their own agenda, their own ambition, their own intent. There will be a false flag event, but it won't be orchestrated by Russia. It'll be orchestrated by the West, most likely the United States, Britain, and Israel, to try and create a flashpoint. And Russia has said this weeks and weeks ago that they had picked up this intelligence. So the West is sort of behind the eight ball. They are scattered. They are disorganized. Their diplomatic objectives and abilities are completely scatterbrained and tattered, very much reflective of Joe Biden's scatterbrained dementia and confusion. So they're trying their best to throw up as much smoke and confusion and distraction as they can against Russia, in the hopes that somehow Russia is going to grow fatigued or be intimidated and hesitant. And I think that is a tragic miscalculation of the Russian temperament, mind, and political stance at this point. They have said very clearly this is not a simple choice of Russia. This is a culmination of 30 years of violence, oppression, deception, and aggression against Russia that the West has orchestrated since the fall of the Soviet Union. And the promises that were made were betrayed. The guarantees were never fulfilled. And Russia has endured and really been injured by many of these actions. The world has indeed been injured by the West's actions after 9/11. And I think this is culminating into the Russians affirming a stance and preparing to defend themselves from what they perceive are existential threats.
Well, let's just discuss the talks between Russia and NATO and the U.S., which have failed. And one reason why they have failed is because NATO and the U.S. refused to meet Russia's security demands. What do you think that happened?
Well, the U.S. and the British and the globalist bankers and many in their circle have been long fantasizing about discombobulating and dismembering Russia into pieces so that they could buy off and use their natural resources. So the West and NATO have been aggressively trying to bluff and push Russia around. And I think they've miscalculated, because Russia is fully prepared and they're very, very competent in diplomatic warfare. And that's what this is. There's diplomatic warfare, there's information warfare, there's military warfare, and there's economic warfare. And they are preparing themselves, and they're winning the diplomatic warfare, and they're winning the informational warfare. But I think an interesting opportunity is, since the West is in such disarray, the best thing that, for example, Iran could do is Iran, Venezuela, and Russia really unite their public relations message around some core beliefs that resonate with Western audiences. And for example, Russia could say, we want to create a world of stability, peace, and independence from the Western juggernaut of destruction and slavery that has been terrorizing the world since 2001. And we are standing up to this hegemonic empire that is seeking to advance a religion of wokeness and force it upon the rest of the world. They would find that many in the European countries and many in America would stand up and side with the moral imperatives of independence, freedom, stability. And also, I think Russia needs to stand up and announce that the Kazakhstan color revolution, which failed, is the same color revolution that the West tried to impose upon Venezuela when they tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government and replace him with Juan Guaido, a CIA asset. So the most important thing that needs to be emphasized is that the West is trying to advance wokeism and a sort of religion of economics and political correctness, and that is destructive to the freedom and the independence of other nations. So Russia and Iran and Venezuela certainly can unite around a moral code and stand up and say what the West has done for 20 years is ruined, destroyed other countries. Look at Libya, look at Syria, and they're trying to do the same thing to Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. And they need to call out the European nations to recognize that they are the ones that will be injured. They're the ones that will lose sons and daughters for wars that the West starts, and that no European should have any interest in participating. And Russia should also emphasize that it's not starting a war. It is defending against a war that the West is trying to trigger, and this false flag claim is the flashpoint.
Mr. Bennett, I have one last question for you, but I want you to answer it like in 30 seconds if you can. Now, speaking of Russia's preparedness, one threat that is being directed towards Russia is that the U.S. says that it will bring the case to the United Nations Security Council. What will the consequences be if it does so?
Well, I think it would be wonderful if the West took any case to the Security Council, because it would give a stage, an opportunity for Russia, for Iran, and other nations to stand up and give their own presentation. The West has always used the United Nations as a platform for pontificating, and as we know from Colin Powell's day, telling flat-out lies and then bribing other countries and other officials to side with those lies in order to give a legal defense to war and crimes against humanity. And that's what they did in Iraq. That's what they did in Afghanistan. Especially Iraq, they claimed, because Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israelis and the Zionist liars, went to the U.S. and claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell got up in front of the United Nations and told those lies. So the United Nations is a platform, is a stage for theatrics. But the West are very bad liars, because they have 20 years of ruin and death that they said was going to instead create blossoms of prosperity, peace, and happiness. And instead, they've destroyed the entire Middle East. Russia and Iran and Venezuela are countries that can stand up and say our fellow countries in the United Nations don't believe them. The reality is quite different. Don't vote with them, vote with us. And I think they'd see the world side with them.
Thank you so much. Mr. Scott Bennett joining us from San Francisco, was a former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer.